India clearly understands the interests that it needs to protect. So India's position is driven by its interests. Putin is not an irrational despot who's got imperial ambitions and therefore he decided one fine morning that today is the day I go into Ukraine. There is a long history to it and there was a build-up, and the Russians were, in a sense, forced into that decision. So I will not put the entire, I will not justify them, the Russians, for getting into this situation. But having got into it, I can fully understand that it's very difficult for them to walk out. Currently, they have been significantly tailored to reflect the realities that exist. And the realities that exist is that the Ukrainians have put up a heroic resistance. There's no doubt about that. They have been able to inflict heavy losses on the Russians.
Hello and welcome to the Hindustan Times podcast. In our first episode, we are joined by Nandan Unnikrishnan, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and he heads the Eurasian Studies program there. Of course, the topic we're going to discuss is clearly the Russia-Ukraine war and the one-year anniversary of Russian invasion of Ukraine. There is no end in sight so far. My first question to you, Mr. Unnikrishnan, is that, it's been a year. It's been a year. Is there a diplomatic end in sight for the Russia-Ukraine war? What with? We just earlier this week, in the run-up to the one-year anniversary, you had Joe Biden landing up in Kyiv for a surprise visit. There was Putin immediately and announcing that, he's going to stand by Ukraine as long as it takes. Then there is Putin, on the other hand, who made a State of the Nation address soon after and digging in his heels and saying that he's fighting for the very existence of Russia. Is there an end in sight?
The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is still no, but with some explanations, I guess. Russia started the war, its ambitions were unclear. I mean, as we were discussing earlier, everyone thought it will end quickly, Russians will be in Kyiv and all that. But whatever I know, because I have been speaking to the Russians right from the beginning, they from February 24th, in fact from earlier, were very clear that this is going to be the long haul.
Okay.
And I think they are proving to be right. That is point number one. The second thing is that the United States, in the current context, is really the only power in the world that has the capability to bring both belligerents to the table, provided it is also at that same table. Right now, the United States does not seem to be interested in that. And as long as the West continues arming Ukraine, the war will continue. I mean, there is no question. If arms stop flowing into Ukraine, talks will start the next day.
All right. So arms stop flowing. So you're putting the onus on the US to stop this war, because that's not what Ukraine has been constantly saying. In fact, just yesterday I was speaking to a Ukrainian MP and he said that, Ukrainian officials are in India, in New Delhi as we speak right now, trying to speak to various parts of the government in their respective areas, trying to sort of tell Prime Minister Modi or urging Prime Minister Modi to sort of bring about some sort of peace and speak to Mr. Putin and sort of get something. So you're saying it's not in Putin's hand, it's in the US's hand.
Till 24th February, it was in Putin's hand. And I not for a moment support or condone what he did. I think invasion of another country, just as the Prime Minister said, in this era is not
an era of war.
It's not the path to go down. At the same time, I do recognize that Putin is not an irrational despot who's got imperial ambitions and therefore he decided one fine morning that today is the day I go into Ukraine. There is a long history to it, and there was a build-up, and the Russians were, in a sense, forced into that decision. So I will not put the entire, I will not justify them, the Russians, for getting into this situation. But having got into it, I can fully understand that it's very difficult for them to walk out. And the only way they can walk out is if they are given some kind of diplomatic dialogue to try and find a via media as to what. We know that in April last year, the two sides initialed an agreement. And at that time, of course, the Russians were to withdraw to pre-24th February lines, positions, and Ukraine would in return basically suggest that it is putting on hold seeking membership of NATO. Clearly today, if negotiations start, you can't go back to that position because the Russians have now formally incorporated into their constitution 4 areas of Ukraine. So unless the realization dawns on everybody, including the Russians, that this war has now reached a level where there is very little that either side can achieve. The Russians at best can probably go to the administrative borders of the 4 districts, 4 areas they have incorporated into the Russian Federation. In any case, there is very little left for them to do there. And I don't think they would have ambitions or stomach for much more. But as Putin said in his speech yesterday, the war will continue. The longer the range of the weapons that Ukraine is supplied with, the deeper into Ukraine Russia will have to go.
So he's clearly put the onus on the West as far as the ending of this war is concerned.
Today, there is no doubt about it. I think there is only one country in the world that is capable of, because when Turkey came up with a solution, it was Boris Johnson who went to Kyiv and told Zelensky to pull out. So now it is clearly the opportunity is for the United States to initiate something. United States should, but President Biden does not seem to be inclined that way as yet.
Why do you think President Biden is not inclined that way as yet? Because, as you're pointing out, they should, but they're not doing it. Why?
But why should they? Because if you look at it, they are the only ones laughing all the way to the bank today after 1 year. The military-industrial complex in the United States is raking it in. Energy companies are raking it in. After Nord Stream was blown up, Europe is forced to buy expensive energy from the United States. The US economy is booming while everyone else is in trouble. So basically, predictions that the US was heading into a recession turned out to be wrong thanks to the war. So I don't see a reason why, if I was sitting in Washington, actually, to come to think of it, why would I want to stop it? I am weakening my existential enemy. After all, Russia is the only country in the world that can annihilate me. I am weakening it. I'm weakening it to a level where it will be a useless ally even to my other emerging enemy, China. So I am
raking in the moolah in the process.
And I'm not losing any lives. I'm not fighting on my territory. So why? It's a win-win.
So as the economy is stupid, as they say. As this war progresses, what role do you think India can play in not just trying to bring an end to this war, because it's clearly not in anybody's interest to let this continue, given at least not in the interest of the global South to let this continue. What role can India and by extension Prime Minister Modi, according to you, play to bring an end to this?
I think India is doing all it can to try and contribute to starting a dialogue. India is, I personally believe in private conversations with the Russian leaders, quite forthright in stating this position. India also understands that even if tomorrow President Putin announces that he is ready to talk, there isn't today in Russia a leader, even if you remove President Putin, who will be able to withdraw from Ukraine overnight.
Right.
There'll have to be a process of negotiation. So India, at the same time, understands that while it can raise its voice in favor of peace, because it's not only about the global south in a political sense. The global south is suffering economically. There are serious spikes in commodity prices, disruptions in food supplies.
Right.
So the growth story of the global south is seriously affected. So I think India is raising its voice. India should do so more in other fora also. But to think that India will be able to bring about peace, I think is a bit too early. We don't have that kind of leverage either with Russia, Ukraine, or the United States. Maybe with Russia a little bit, but with the other two, we definitely don't have leverage.
All right. So I'll just going to shift focus. So the war clearly is going to continue for some time to come, because no one, as we started with, no one expected it to last for 2 months, let alone an entire year. Having said that, what is Putin's end game? You're saying you're in talk with Russian leaders. What is Putin's end game right now? Because he's in the latest, he's ripped up that nuclear treaty with the US. It is going to be a problem going forward. The United States is clearly not stopping supplying weapons. How do you see Putin extending this for another year, or is there an end in sight as far as he's concerned? Okay, now that I have Donbas region and I'm going to annex it and make it a part of my territory, it's part of Russian territory now. Is that sufficient for him? Is that going to be sufficient? Are the others going to let him get away with that, especially US and Ukraine?
Well, what you're asking me to do is to look into the crystal ball a little bit. I'm not adept
But
at
from
that.
your understanding and
from
your talks with the leaders there in Russia.
Firstly, I don't really speak to leaders. I speak to people who are in the know of things,
Right.
but none of them
leaders
are
in the
leaders.
sense, yeah. Okay.
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, my impression is twofold. One is that currently, whatever Russia's ambitions may have been when the war started, currently they have been significantly tailored to reflect the realities that exist. And the realities that exist is that the Ukrainians have put up a heroic resistance. There's no doubt about that. They have been able to inflict heavy losses on the Russians. And the Russians recognize that taking control of Ukraine is not on the cards anymore. So I would imagine that, and there's no reason to believe that Putin is irrational. So I would believe that as a rational leader, plus his circle of advisors and the elite that supports him, will probably tailor their demands to, or their ambitions to, taking in what the Russian Federation has officially claimed. As of September, Donbas, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, these administrative districts of Ukraine, have been incorporated into the Russian Federation. So I think now that they are constitutionally part of the Russian Federation, it becomes incumbent on any Russian president to at least make an effort to try and physically take control of them. I think that is the process that is taking place right now. Is that acceptable to the West? I don't think so, judging by the current rhetoric. That is not acceptable. At the same time, I think even Western leaders recognize that there is no hope of winning this war against Russia in terms of throwing Russia out of Ukraine and taking back Crimea and all that. Those are attractive slogans, but they are not on the cards. So clearly, it now depends on how long the Western leaders have the stomach to support Ukraine. Because at this point of time, Ukraine is entirely living as a result of economic and military aid from the Western countries.
Yeah, at least that's the one thing that's been exposed by this war, that without Western arms and supplies, Ukraine really doesn't have a stomach for any kind of pushback against Russia. But let's just talk about India now. That let's just shift focus and talk about India. We spoke about India a little earlier, but I want to understand India's response. It's been a year since the war. A lot has been discussed and talked about how India is, taking a middle path. There is Prime Minister Modi, who goes and talks to Mr. Putin and tells him that our friendship is unbreakable on one hand, also telling him on the other hand that this is not an era of war, as he did. Um, uh, but a year into the war, India has refused to condemn the invasion, Russian invasion into Ukraine. Tell our viewers, a bit about what's the mindset 1 year down the line. That's what we've done this 1 year. Do you see that stance changing, becoming more solidified one way or the other as the war gets into its second year, as far as India is
Look,
concerned?
I think India's position of uh, not condemning the Russians in the United Nations, uh, doing so not in terms of condemning but criticizing them privately rather than publicly, is because India clearly understands the interests that it needs to protect. So India's position is driven by its interests. It is not driven by a desire to please the Russians or the Americans or anyone else,
Right.
for that matter. 1 year later, I don't see India's interests have changed much. I don't, in fact, see any change. So I
Right.
don't see any reason why India would shift. If the war continues, let's say, notionally till September, I mean,
The next 6
foreseeable,
months.
let's
Right.
say 6 months, right? If the war continues, I don't see any monumental event occurring in these 6 months that would fundamentally change India's or fundamentally affect India's national interest. So
Right.
again, I don't see India being pushed to significantly change its position on the war. However, if there is some kind of black swan event, unpredictable,
True.
yes, India would definitely adjust whatever it has to in its positions to protect its own
Its own
interests.
interests.
So the point here is that India is not doing what it is doing because somebody wants India to do something or the other. India is doing it because it feels that this is the best way to protect its interests.
Let's talk about those interests, and one of those interests is oil, right? Because India is not an oil producing nation. We import our oil, and a large part of that imports is now moved to Russia. We were largely importing from the Middle East, but now I think our percentage of imports from Russia, the discounted oil from Russia, has gone up significantly. How big a factor is that in shaping India's interests at this present moment?
Well, you mentioned the critical word, discounted oil.
Yes.
The point is, India is a price sensitive economy. India's primary challenge today is economic growth, lifting those below the poverty line. And India needs a lot of energy to achieve that goal. So today, if anybody is willing to supply oil at rates cheaper than what the Russians are offering, I'm sure India will
Sure,
take
yeah.
it, right? But the point is, I doubt there is any entity in the world today that will be able to match that price. So India is not at any point of time here going to go against its own interests because this does not suit somebody else. Again, I don't see any reason why. Yes, you're right. India's purchase in percentage terms has gone from below 1% to over 20%. So I don't see any reason why that is likely to change. The second thing is, India is also benefiting on the other end. This crude that is brought in is processed and used not only in India, but it generates a lot of exports for us because we sell the petrol and the diesel and the other derivatives that are produced. we sell it to the West.
Right.
So, in fact, the West is quite happy with that situation.
Exactly. And, initially when India's, and I remember Jaishankar pointedly being asked questions in Western media that, why are you still importing? And him giving back a very stern response saying that, hey, look inwards first and then talk about how much India is importing. We don't import a fraction of the US, of the Russian oil that you guys import. But having said that, those voices have also sort of quietened down now because of this self-interest that because the West is able to take advantage of this discounted Russian oil without its getting its hands dirty, so to speak. Do you see that as the reason for those voices piping down now? The West seems
Well,
very comfortable with
there
the
are
idea
multiple
of
reasons.
India importing discounted Russian oil now.
Yeah, I think the primary reason is probably that because if the West had to, if India would suspend buying discounted oil, then the West would have to buy the end products at a much higher price. So there is a self-interest there. But it's not only commercial interests that are driving the West here. There are also geopolitical interests because it is quite clear that China is emerging as the main challenge to the Western world order that has come up after 1945. And the West feels that India is a critical part in its, well, I won't call it a fight, but in its strategy to try and manage China's rise in an amicable manner. So India has two things going for it at this point of time. One is the geopolitical interest of the West, as well as the economic interest of the West.
Right. You talked about China, and yes, China is, frankly, for India, China is the red line, not Russia, not Ukraine, not America. Is India's present policy strategy as far as the Russia-Ukraine war apt to counter a close Russia-China relationship, which seems to be emerging post the new situations in the world that have emerged?
The Russia-China partnership is definitely growing closer. And it is a matter of concern for India. And India is keeping a close eye on the developments on that front. But at the same time, particularly reflected by the recent visit of National Security Advisor Mr. Ajit Doval to Moscow, his meetings with President Putin, India seems comfortable with the understanding that Russia has not yet become a junior partner of China and that this is not likely to happen for some time more. So, in that sense, Russia is a useful partner to prevent the Chinese hegemony on the Asian continent. And therefore, I see the India-Russia relationship continuing quite vigorously.
Do you see the India Russia the Russia China India, because there have been people talking about it, emerging as an axis in the new world order that is emerging? Do you see that happening given the brickbats between China and India?
Well, I don't think anyone can rationally expect that a new axis will emerge in the RIC, that is Russia, India, China triangle, because unless China and India resolve their differences, it will be very difficult for India to find common ground with China. The Russians are also understand this, and while they're keen that India sort of develops a closer relationship with China, they also understand the limitations that exist in that relationship and are not pushing India in any direction of trying to compromise with its interests. The Chinese, as we can see, are not being quite cooperative. So let us hope the situation changes, because eventually India and China do have to sort out their differences. The two largest, I mean, the two more fastest growing economies and likely to be the largest in the next 20, 30 years, cannot afford to be in this kind of situation.
Do you see Russia playing a role in resolving those differences?
I
Should
don't
Russia
think
be playing a
I
role?
don't think Russia will attempt to become a mediator. But will Russia facilitate any kind of conversation between India and China? Yes, they would. I mean, we saw that in 2020, immediately after Galwan, the first contacts between India and China took place in Moscow. But the Russians didn't mediate it. They merely offered a platform and said, you have to talk to each other. So similarly, I don't think the Russians want to get involved in a conversation between India and China. There's a saying in Russian that in matters of love and war, only an idiot gives advice. So I don't think the Russians are idiots yet. I don't think they're getting there.
Okay, they're not idiots yet, and neither are they getting there. But in terms of, and this is really my last question to you. In terms of India's ambitions to become a $5 trillion economy, to sort of stake its claim at the world stage, to sort of become a global leader, or at least a voice of the global south now with the G20 presidency, where again the Russia-Ukraine war shadow looms large over that presidency too. How do you see India's role going forward, or what's the emerging role that you see for India given this conflict and given India's ambitions and given the G20 presidency?
Well, one is the G20 presidency is a one-year affair.
Yeah.
India is not going to emerge as a global economy or a global leader in that 1 year. But this is definitely a step that will enhance India's stature. And India should utilize this opportunity to do that. The second thing is, yes, if India gets its growth story right, there is nothing to stop India from achieving its potential of being not just a global power, but one of the most important global powers, and playing a fairly definitive role in framing the rules of the emerging new world order.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast, and thank you viewers for watching. We will come back to you with more. Stay tuned to Hindustan Times.